Good evening. Welcome to another installment of Harmony Equine and Harmony Muzzles webinar series. Tonight we're going to talk about fall grazing and how to avoid the dangers, because we tend to think that once the summer is over that we can kind of relax, but unfortunately that is not the case. Horses run on forage, and we're talking mainly about grasses and grazing here. If anybody's on this webinar that was not on one of our previous ones, you can go back and look at sort of our forage management webinar, and we'll talk in more broad terms. This is just about what happens in the fall and the winter. So we need forage in the form of grasses whenever we can, and we only really need to add concentrates or grain to make up the difference between what horses need for energy intake to run their metabolism and the amount of calories that we need for whatever performance the horse is doing. Some horses maintain their weight no matter how hard you ride them. Other horses, you ride them for an extra half an hour and you get to feed them an extra 2 or 3 pounds of grain. Just depends on the individual horse. So the thing that we are so concerned about when we talk about grazing is these fructans. So what really are fructans? Fructans are sugars, and a lot of us sort of know that. And they're present in forage, in grasses. And one of the keys is that they don't get broken down in the stomach and small intestine the way sugars do. They pass into the hindgut. And if you get a lot of fructans into the hindgut, large intestine, then the pH can actually change in the large intestine. And part of that is because of lactic acid production. But anytime you change the pH anywhere in the digestive tract, and we'll definitely be doing some webinars on the digestive tract and how to keep it healthy. But anytime we change the pH, that changes the gut bacteria. So the quality of the gut bacteria, the types of gut bacteria change whenever the pH changes. When the pH changes and is not what it's supposed to be for that part of the gut, that creates inflammation. So once you have inflammation, you can start an entire trigger or cascade of events that can lead to colic or laminitis. And we will not go into those details in this webinar, but in another one at another time. So in the grasses, we actually have our fructans that we just talked about, and we also have starches. So we have grasses that grow best in the summertime. They're called warm season grasses. And we have grasses that grow best in the spring and fall, and those are considered cool season grasses. And they'll call them C3 grasses for cool season and C4 for warm season, but it's easier to just think about the season that they grow in. So our fructans are our primary carbohydrate in the cool season grasses. You can see that the cool season grasses are many of your common grasses that we make hays out of, many of the common grasses that are in your pastures. So these ones make the fructans, which are the sugars that really cause a problem. The starches, which sometimes don't cause as much problem, they certainly can because they get broken down into sugars in the digestive tract, but our legumes actually have more starches, and those are our clovers and alfalfas. Our warm season grasses, which are ones that grow in the summertime, and some of those warm season grasses are also our native grasses, which we talked about a lot in the webinar on forage management. And the warm season grasses, most of those are past their peak at this time of year, and they're pretty coarse and tough. And they also tend to store their starch, which is their carbohydrate, inside the cells. And that's limited by the cell size, whereas the cool season grasses actually store the sugars, their fructans, kind of outside the cell, basically in places where they can make unlimited amounts, which they do to protect themselves from weather changes. So you can think about it like having one of those pods out in your backyard. You can put a lot of stuff in it. So they put a lot of stuff into their sort of extracellular places. One of the grasses that we have to talk about as we talk about the season changing is fescue. Not all parts of the country have fescue. Fescue is sort of a mid-Atlantic into the Midwest type of grass. So anywhere from parts of Pennsylvania all the way to Iowa and Illinois, and then down towards the south into Missouri a little bit more, and back to parts of North Carolina and other areas that have, especially some of the higher elevations may have fescue. So you can find out if you need to know whether fescue exists in your area. Check with your local extension agent, and they can tell you. Fescue is an interesting grass because it's bitter in the summertime, and after the frost, it becomes sweet and much more palatable. Fescue also has some toxins associated with it, which can be a problem with pregnant mares, and can also be a significant problem in grazing cattle. But the horses basically don't want to eat it in the summertime unless there's nothing else to eat. It becomes sweet after the frost, so they want to eat it, but sweetness also translates into fructans and sugars. It's a very cold-tolerant grass, and the animals can graze it all winter. So as long as it's green, it's nutritious. And you can do this with your own pastures as well, if you have enough land. If you mow it off in sort of August, I think they say technically the middle of August for the mid-Atlantic area where I am, you mow it off and then just leave it and start grazing it again in December and January, you actually can have grass all winter if you need the grass for your horses. And the one thing about it is that it won't regrow in the cold weather. So once they've eaten it down, it is eaten down, but it can still be quite nutritious. So you can have a horse founder on a fescue field in the middle of February. There are a lot of seasonal changes in these sugars, mostly fructans that we're concerned about. So our early fall and autumn pastures are generally intermediate in sugar content, especially when we compare them to spring and midsummer. But as that weather shifts and we start to have cool nights, the cool nights don't encourage the plant to grow. So what sometimes happens is that as the temperature drops, the sugars can actually accumulate because they are not being used by the process of respiration that I mentioned in the bottom. In the cellular respiration and breathing and activity helps burn up some of the sugar content. But if the grass isn't doing any growing because it's too cool, then that sugar doesn't get used up during the night. So the cooler nights can actually give us higher sugar content. The temperature fluctuations, that warmer day, cooler night, has a tendency to affect this sugar production or it's sugar utilization, really. So as the cooler temperatures happen, you actually get fructans accumulating. If you have a sudden drop into below freezing, that's kind of a shock to the plant, and they actually change over to soluble sugars to use it more like an antifreeze to protect the plant against freezing. Sugars are generally not as dangerous to horses, but to a horse who's sensitive to carbohydrates in general, a freezing night can definitely make the grasses sweeter than the horse might need. So, kind of a rule of thumb to take away from a little bit of this science is that warm days and cool nights, nights that are below 40 degrees, not a 60-degree night, those are nights that you may not want to graze your really sensitive horses. And you also may not want to graze them first thing in the morning. If you do graze, that maybe 8 to 10 o'clock in the morning after the sun's been up for a little bit, that might be a good time. But some of those horses, you're going to have to be very careful and not graze them much at all. In general, if you have sun during the day and it's kind of warm at night, then you can graze early in the morning and your fructan levels will be lowest, and that will be your safest time. Fructans are usually lower in the middle of winter and in the very midsummer if there is significant freezing in the winter. So if you're in a cold climate, generally the fructans are lowest unless you happen to have fescue. However, you can go out there sometimes and see some green at the bottom of the grass. So you look at the grass and you say, oh, the grass looks all dead. And then you go out there and you actually look at it and you'll see just a little bit of green down by the soil. That little bit of green can have a very high sugar concentration. And sometimes the layer of snow can actually keep those grasses alive and green because they can actually insulate it. And if the snow is kind of thin and the light penetrates it, you can actually have photosynthesis taking place and making more sugars. So then the snow melts off, you have a nice warm day, and there will be a lot of sugars in that little tiny short bit of grass that's at the bottom of the plant. Cloud cover does reduce fructan production. Shade also reduces it. So if you have a shady part of the pasture or plant some trees around your pasture so that eventually you'll have some shade, that will make your grass safer to eat for your sensitive horses. Obviously, horses who can tolerate a lot of sugar or who are burning a lot of calories in their work, you don't have to worry about these fructans and sugars in the grass. You actually need some of these. When we talk about drought, and if there's certainly some parts right around where I am, particularly at my own house, but in the general area in Northern Virginia, we've been in a pretty severe drought. And there are places out into the Midwest that are also, and up into Pennsylvania, that are in a severe drought. So you look out and everything looks really brown, and you think that it's totally safe to turn your sensitive laminitic horse out. And you certainly are going to have less viable grass. You can have some very brown, dry grass, but what happens inside the plant is that the plant actually will make some fructans in order to try and protect it from dying. And in one study, the fructans increased to 35 to 40% of the dry matter in the stem bases after 3 months of drought. So by 3 months of drought, you're pretty much thinking that everything's dead. But in that small bit of plant that's still alive, you can have a very high concentration. Then comes along a rain, and it might only be a half an inch or an inch of rain, hardly enough to really break the drought, and the grass goes crazy. And that is actually some of the most dangerous time to turn your horses out, is just after that drought has broken. Once the grass is growing normally again, then you have your standard pattern of less fructans in the early morning, more fructans late afternoon. But when you're breaking a drought, it can be a serious problem. And a lot of times you don't even really think about it because everything's been so dry. The time of day I've mentioned a few times is generally the sugars are going to accumulate in the grasses in the early morning, reach their peak by the afternoon or late afternoon, and then at night the plant is going to use the energy to grow, if it's growing, unless it's too cold to grow. So talk a lot about the tallness of the grass. And tall grass does have less, or its fructans are generally more distributed. The problem is that a lot of the fructans can concentrate at the bottom, but also really tall grass, the horses can eat an awful lot of at one time. So it kind of negates the idea of having less sugars in the grass. If you leave it tall, they can go out and shovel it in 10 times as fast than when it's short. So you just have to watch your own horse's level of sensitivity to the amount they can shovel into their mouth versus keeping the grass really short and having each bite fairly sweet, but having each bite fairly small. So if you've got this grass that's not behaving itself and it's producing too much sugar, how are you going to control it? Muzzling, of course, and I stuck in here the slow feeders, but those are really for hay rather than for grasses. So we'll kind of skip over that. But slow feeders are a wonderful idea for feeding the hay part of things, and we talked more about them in the other webinar. You can also feed hay to the horses before you turn them out on grass. And this can be especially useful if you're going to turn them out for a few hours in the morning. Go ahead and feed them their morning concentrate, and then give them a flake of hay, and they won't be quite so desperate to shovel as much grass into their mouth as they possibly can. For muzzles, we've got Harmony Muzzles, which are open, light, and airy, easy to keep clean, and the horses, for the most part, don't hate it. Occasionally, they will still try to escape from it, and occasionally they will try to take it off, but for the most part, they aren't bothered by it, even in this 95-degree weather that we've just been having here in Virginia. So if you need to control intake, have a look at the muzzles, and your horses will actually appreciate you for it. The other thing that you can do is to help burn those calories. So when the weather is freezing, the horses are outside and they're actually burning calories to keep themselves warm. And they grow fur to keep themselves warm. And if you watch horses, if you're in a snowy area and you watch horses when the snow is coming down, you'll actually see snow accumulating on their back. That snow is accumulating on their back because the insulation system of their fur is working. And it's keeping their body temperature in close to the skin. And by the time you get to the outside, it's just like having a down jacket on. If somebody touches the outside of your down jacket, it feels cool to the touch, but you put your hand inside your down jacket and you're toasty and warm. So the same thing happens with horses. Their fur keeps all their body heat inside. It doesn't always work quite as well when it's pouring down rain because they will actually get wet to the skin. And sometimes they actually are much colder when it's 35 and raining than when it's 0 degrees and snowing. So let them burn some calories. Ditch the blankets. If you have to clip a horse because you're working him hard in the winter, that's a good thing because you're riding him regularly, and it'd be much better to be riding him than just having him burn his own calories. But if you don't have to clip, then don't clip and let their fur do the work and let them digest the forage and stay warm. So the way that horses stay warm is not by feeding extra grain, it's by letting them have extra forage, because it's the breakdown of the forage in the large intestine, in the cecum, that helps keep them warm. So you will actually see, especially if you're monitoring hay intake, if it is well below freezing, in the 10 to 0 or even below 0 range, those horses will actually eat a significant amount more of hay than they do on a night where it's 40 degrees or 35 degrees. And that is because they're using the hay to actually keep themselves warm. So let them burn their own calories, digest their own food, and let them do the work. And to help burn calories, of course, the best option is to go out for a ride. You can also do supplements to improve their metabolism, because there are a lot of horses that you cannot starve enough to get them to lose weight. And if you need to improve their metabolism, my OB and INR formulas are designed to actually improve insulin sensitivity, and we did a whole webinar on insulin resistance. And as their metabolism improves, they can actually be out and graze for a longer period of time. On the other hand, if you need to supplement grazing time with a horse that's a hard keeper, I tend to focus on easy keepers because it seems like I have most of those to deal with. But for the hard keepers, feeding fats, either coconut oil or rice bran oil or some form of a fat, can be one of the best ways to add safe calories without making them mentally or physically high. A lot of times just increasing carbohydrate and grain intake will make them mentally high and more unrideable, where fats will tend to keep them sane and on the ground. Okay, we talked about this, but the donkey with the muzzle is so cute that I had to put him back in. So to manage your grazing for the winter, you can still rotate your paddocks just like you can during the rest of the year. Moving your electric fences can be a little harder because the ground can be frozen, but you can definitely continue to use your rotational grazing. And particularly if you have fescue, you can open up a new strip of grass once a week or once a day so that they aren't grazing the whole thing down at one time. You can always keep them in the barn for part of the day if you need to. I did put a slide in for horses without weight problems. Obviously, they can graze freely. You pay attention to how they handle the carbohydrate. I do have some horses that if they get out on too much grass, it seems to behave like getting too much grain. They get a little bit high, a little bit less stable mentally. Try to use your forage and your grazing time as much as you can, so that you're actually adding as little grain or concentrate as you possibly can. The concentrate feeds are artificial feeds for horses. Forage is a natural feed. And of course, 24 hours a day is the most natural. We talked quite a bit about the diversity of plants out in your fields, and you will find that a lot of the quote-unquote weeds that we have in the field, they're actually herbs, but a lot of those die back in the wintertime. Some of them do not. And so you can pay attention to what is out there, what actually has some greenness to it in the wintertime in your part of the country. And sometimes you want to know because some of those plants can be a little bit toxic, but most of the time the plants that are still alive are perfectly fine for the horses to nibble on. Come the early spring, they will want to eat dandelions, and that is an excellent spring plant for them to eat. So you can put them out on your neighbors' lawns, and they'll eat the dandelions. And there's just a link, and we will provide you with the link to the PowerPoint and to the webinar itself within the next few days. So that's a link where you can read some more about plant diversity. Learning about the grasses that are in your area, you can definitely talk to your extension agents and find out what grasses do grow in the winter in your area. Some parts of the country, Florida in particular, may have grass that looks a little bit green in the winter time. And certainly to my northern eye, when I first went down to Florida in the winter, it looks like there's grass out there. But in reality, that grass does go into a dormant state, and it is not nutritional for the horses at all. And that's where learning what grows in your area is really important, especially if you've moved to a new area and the grasses are different from where you came from. So diversify, feed a variety of things, but don't make yourself crazy with unreasonable grazing schedules. If you naturally get up early in the morning, that works perfectly. If you want to minimize your fructan grazing time and just graze from, say, 6 to 8 in the morning or something like that. If you want to go out at midnight and turn them out till 3 a.m., that's perfectly fine too. But don't make yourself too crazy. Try to use your pastures and your electric fences and your muzzles to help make your own personal life easier. So that is it for tonight. And we will take questions with the little question and answer thing by your screen. And thank you all for coming. And it seems that people are quite interested in these webinars. We're going to come up with some more topics. You're certainly welcome, if you have topics that you would like to see covered, to send us an email. And I can't promise that everything's going to get covered, but I'm very open to hearing what you all are interested in learning about. Does anybody have any questions? Sometimes they take a few minutes to come in, so I'll hang out here for another minute or so. No questions? Okay, it doesn't look like we're going to get any questions tonight. Certainly, if you have some questions, send it to our email, and we will see you next time. Looks like we have some raised hands here. Okay, well, thank you all for coming, and we will see you next time.